Hey everybody, it's Dylan here. I'm a real estate agent in Charlotte, North Carolina with Tate Realtors, and I have a question for you. Have you gotten into that phase yet where all your friends are starting to buy houses and they're telling you, buy a house, but you're still in the apartment that you got into once you moved out of your parents, and you're questioning, should I buy a house? Well, let's get into that. So for the sake of simplicity of this video, we're just gonna talk about buying a house that you're planning on living in, not necessarily an investment property. I'll talk more about that in a future video. So I wanna talk about this idea of buying versus renting. And there's a couple of things we have to talk about in terms of considerations. And the first consideration is personal. Here's a few questions you may ask when you are deciding on what's personal to you and making that decision. So the first question is, are you ready to be a homeowner? So there's really two sides of this coin here. Maybe you've been living in an apartment for a while and you're kind of tired of the ups and downs of having somebody look over your shoulder, or perhaps you actually like renting because you don't have to worry about the excess time and money that you have to invest into actually owning your own property. Another question that is a personal favorite of mine to address is, am I throwing money away by renting? This is a pretty common myth in the real estate industry, and myth is probably not the right word for it, but it's a misconception of what renting really is. So with renting, you're not paying a principal to actually gain equity in a property, but you can potentially use your money to actually leverage investments in different ways. And I'll get to that in a second. And with buying, you have monthly taxes and insurance and interest that you're never gonna see again. You have to pay that money, but you're not gonna see it. However, you do gain equity in the property. So now let's ask, do I want to have a place that I can actually call my home? And this is a bit subjective because of course you can make an apartment your home, but go with me here. So here's an analogy for you, and I'm not a big analogy guy, so this may seem a little contrived for you. And I'm not a big word guy either, so I don't know why I just said that, but buying a house is kind of like painting on a brand new canvas. You get to make it look and feel however you want. And renting is kind of like borrowing somebody's canvas that's already been painted, and you can paint or repaint certain areas, but it's only if that person allows you to do that. And then the last question I want to ask, and it's probably the most important, is what is actually personal to you? Do you need the freedom to make your house your own? Do you prefer the amenities that your apartment complex allows you to have? Does taking care of a house sound like way too much right now? Or does not getting any equity out of the place that you live in right now, does that idea drive you crazy? These are all questions that you can ask yourself, and it's important to, but think about what's personal to you and then ask yourself those questions. So moving on from the personal, let's get into the one that most people end up talking about, which is the financial side. The financial decision of buying or renting is pretty subjective to you. However, the numbers behind the financial decision are not subjective. So something that you'll hear often is that stocks will actually give you a greater return on investment than real estate year over year. And what someone is trying to say when they say that is, if you let a house sit and then you let a stock sit, the stock is going to actually grow in value faster than the house would. Which in most cases, and generally that's true, but what they don't mention is a lot of the personal side or the time side, like we'll talk about later. You have to look at this from a whole picture perspective. So the initial investment of actually buying a house is normally pretty large. It's a big investment, and it's comprised of two key categories. The first being down payment and the second being closing costs. Knowing that, one of the biggest arguments I hear for renting is that you can take the money you would typically use to purchase a home, the down payment and the closing costs, and you can use that money in different investing techniques that's going to typically give you a greater ROI, which is return on investment. So this is a huge benefit for renting, it really is. And it's a lot of times the determining factor for people that don't want to invest their money in real estate, even when they've heard people say, buy a house, buy a house. So when you're buying a house, you're really accepting the expectation that your year over year return is probably going to be lower than if you had invested that same money into the stock market. But then you also have to consider everything outside of the financial side when buying a house too. And then you can also consider this term called leverage. So what does leverage in real estate mean? Essentially, it's using someone else's money, typically a bank, using their money to purchase a property while you put in some of your money, but you get all the equity from that purchase. So let's talk about an example. Let's say you buy a house for $100,000, you put down $10,000 of your own money, and the bank puts up $90,000. So the benefit of owning the home in this regard is that you're actually gaining the equity 100% from that $100,000. So let's say that your home grows in value at 3% on $100,000. So now your house is worth $103,000. you've now accrued $3,000 of equity on your $10,000 investment. And then a little side note, this is what a lot of investors will do to be able to gather 5 houses rather than one and be able to get the cash flow from all 5 of those houses rather than one. We'll talk about that later, but I absolutely love talking about that, so I'll definitely make a video on that. So next, let's talk about the long-term investment for both of these. So if you're going to be purchasing a home to actually live in it for a while, say 10 years, then more than likely you're gonna get the year-over-year growth in that home that makes it a sensible purchase for you in pretty much any scenario. But again, if you're buying with the expectation to outpace the stock market, then you're probably mistaken. The stock market is typically viewed as a more lucrative investment for if you're gonna kind of set it and forget it. But with a home, you can make updates to it, you can do additions to it, so you can kind of add to that value, which you can't really do with a stock. Here's kind of the bottom line, I think. I would say in terms of long-term investments, try and do both. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Try to diversify your portfolio so that you can limit your risk. That's definitely what I would recommend. Get into real estate, stock market, annual dividends, whatever you can find, be able to diversify that portfolio. So next we're gonna talk about the mortgage payment and the rent payment, and these aren't incredibly similar, but I'm gonna try to give some comparisons that helps us get to a point where we feel comfortable understanding both of them. So your mortgage payment is made up of these 4 pillars that a lot of people in the business call PITI, P-I-T-I, which stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So the P, or principal, is what you're actually paying on the loan. That's the money that you would see again if you sold. And then ITI, which is interest, taxes, insurance, that's money that you would never see again. So most people, when they're buying a house, they're gonna get what's called a 30-year fixed loan. And essentially what that means is your monthly mortgage amount, your monthly payment is going to stay the same through the entirety of the loan. And the common misconception that happens is that means that your principal is the same, your interest is the same, and mainly those are the same. But it's actually not the case. I'm gonna get into that a little bit here. In actuality, you're gonna be paying a lot more interest at the front part of the loan the first few years of buying the house rather than the principal, which is a bit crazy, and a lot of people don't realize this when they're buying a house. But let's look at this example of a home that was bought for $300,000 at a 3.02 interest rate. So as you can see here, if you look down at 2027, the person won't stop paying majority interest on their loan payment until 2027. So what's the takeaway from this? Basically, a normal loan that you would get is going to load up the interest at the front, assuming there's a chance you may sell the house, which there is a good chance of that, and then you'll have paid a bunch of interest rather than paying a bunch of the principal. So this is a huge factor when you're determining, do I go ahead and buy a house or do I stay put and I rent for a few more years? So you could need a place to live for about 2 years, but when you run the numbers and you look at how much principal you're actually paying into a house, it may not be worth it for that time period. So when you balance both options, renting may actually be a better option for you if you're not planning on staying in a house for a few years. But if you are deciding that you're going to rent, you need to be thinking about how you're going to use that money that you were planning on using on a house and potentially reinvest it into other options. Perhaps you could invest that money in a rental, which is what I would do and what I would recommend, because you can, on top of getting this annual growth in the home, you can also get cash flow, which is massive. So the rent payment, and yes, this is often viewed as money that is just thrown away. Now, there is some validity to that statement, and I mean, the truth is, when you pay that money, you're never gonna see that money again, and you're not gaining any equity in the property. However, I believe that there is a better way to actually view rent payment. Think of it this way. Rent payments are necessary to be able to provide you a place to live so that you can invest your money in other areas. Maybe it's rentals, maybe it's the stock market, whatever. And now let's jump into our final category, which is timing. Timing's key in everything, right? When is the right time to get a house? When is the right time to rent? It's always a part of the equation. So let's talk about timing from the perspective of, is it actually the right time to buy a house? And if so, here's a few considerations that we have to be thinking through. The first one is the down payment / the monthly mortgage. So let's ask, do you actually have enough money to put towards a down payment to get your monthly mortgage where it would need to be? So many times people buy with their maximum budget in mind. I know that we can afford this, so let's go all the way up to here for our monthly payment. The hard part about this scenario is that What if that monthly amount or that maximum budget gives you no wiggle room? So if you're in a position where your monthly mortgage would ultimately make you go into debt, it's not the right time to buy a house. Another consideration would be if your family is growing. And yes, a lot of times that's viewed as kids, but maybe you have 2 dogs. Where are my dog lovers out there? And you want a yard and you want to be able to actually have a space for them to run. So you may not fit into that 2-bedroom apartment anymore. I know that was the case with my family. So we have 2 little boys and we spent about a year living in this little 2-bedroom apartment where our youngest would sleep in the crib at the foot of our bed. It pushed us into a position where we knew we had to either go find like a $1,500 a month apartment so we could get an extra bedroom and maybe a little bit more room, or we could go find a house. And I know not everyone has the ability to just have the cash to be able to go get a house, but if you can make that happen, or if that's the launching pad, the catalyst, so to speak, that gets you the momentum to save for a house, then that's okay. And then here's another one. Maybe you're in the position, honestly, that you don't want a landlord anymore. And I get it. Some people may think that's a little petty. I personally don't. I think that if that's how you feel, you should feel empowered to now take the step to save for a home or go buy a home if that's what you really want. And you could also have a great landlord and not feel constrained by anything. And maybe that's the reason you stay in your rental. Maybe that is the whole point of sticking around, is because your landlord is great. And there's plenty of good and bad landlords out there. I've been a landlord, and I was probably both at one point or another. And so it is an important part of the decision. Don't let it just be, landlord is such a small thing. It's not. Let it be what it is to you. So renting, cons. There's no equity coming in a rent payment. And a rent payment by itself is not an investment. You do have to have a landlord. Even if it's a great one, it's still a landlord. And you don't have the freedom to be able to update or always make a home feel exactly the way that you want it because of strains on your lease. So cons for buying a house. When you buy a house, all the maintenance and the repairs, they're on you as the homeowner. And you normally need larger funds for the initial purchase. And not talking to people like getting a USDA loan, but for most of us, you're gonna have to have somewhat of a big down payment and pay somewhat of the closing costs. The investment of your down payment, it's only going towards your house. So it's not always the most lucrative investing option. Let's talk about renting pros. Like we just talked about with the money being tied up in the house, you can actually use that money for different investing options. You don't really have as much responsibility for some of the larger maintenance issues that you may run into that you would if you owned a house, pending of course what is written in your lease. You also have the option of flexibility to move. I didn't talk about this much, but if you don't like where you're living or you don't like your living situation or you do need to upgrade or whatever it is, once your lease is over, you can just move. And then finally, the pros of buying a house. You get to become your own landlord and you finally get to do whatever you want to your home. You're almost always gonna get more bang for your buck when you buy a home, especially if your family is growing. This is gonna be really key for you. For example, we paid $200 less than we pay right now for a 950 square foot 2-bedroom apartment. And now we have a 1,950 square foot house with 4 bedrooms, and it just feels a lot better. We only pay $200 more. And then you also kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You get the equity of a home, and then you also get your place to live. So although there isn't necessarily like a black and white clear answer, I hope that this has made it a little bit more clear for you and you have the right decision for you, because honestly, that's really all that matters. And if you're looking for a realtor to either help you buy or sell a house, then hit me up. Even if you're not in Charlotte, I work with a network that allows me to help you get connected to great realtors near you. So hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you soon.